In my view, the human right to freedom of religion or belief, well, it also includes non-religious belief, important to note, was not so very important 50, 60 years ago in Europe because there was not much discussion about it, not much conflict. With the arrival in many northern and western and central European countries of a lot of immigrants, refugees, economic immigrants and so on, and it's happening all the time. Many of those are Muslims, but there are also other diversities growing. Then the human right to freedom of religion or belief has become more urgent because diversity should be welcome, but it is also raising challenges. Challenges in school, in the practice of religion, building of religious places of worship, mosques, synagogues, churches. And I mentioned school. What kind of religious education should there be in school? That brings conflict. How about certain, we might think, silly things like, what about young people having gym, physical education? According to our Muslim immigrants, they seem to think and hold that their children should have gender-separated physical education, which is totally at odds with tradition in my country, which is Norway, and in most Western European countries. So, therefore, it has been a challenge to us who work with human rights to work more seriously and to dig more deeper than we have earlier, deeper than we did earlier, on what exactly are the limits of diversity, how could we make it more generous, and so on. I don't know whether I have one dimension which is that dimension which makes freedom of religious belief particularly important now. The obvious answer is, of course, that it is my conviction and it is the principle of human rights that each human being has equal dignity and has freedom, and there should be no discrimination against that human being because of his or her religion or non-religious conviction. And easily said, not exactly easily practiced. What do you do with churchyards, graveyards? Should Muslims have their own area? Some countries think that is difficult. Yes, and obviously, because that would be one appeal Muslims would make and have been making. However, we have to speak about specific issues. Halal food, no problem. In general, I mean, there are halal butchers and there are halal people selling, there are Islamic merchants selling for Muslims. How about halal food in prisons, in hospitals, in the military? In some countries it has been problematic. There has been some initial conflicts in my country, but what we do is simply to prepare and serve halal food to hospital patients, to military men and women. In Norway, women also do military service, and also in prisons. So, Shari'a law is very often used as almost a point where you can scare Europeans. But if you get to the facts, I don't think there's terribly many problems that arise from claims to be able to practice halal, to practice Shari'a, excuse me. And also because, as far as I know from my Muslim friends, Shari'a tells Muslims who are minorities to abide and respect the law of the land. And generally they do. Well, you are now inviting something which is dear to me, although I think it is a sad event which I'm thinking of in particular, and that is the judgment concerning women, Muslim women wanting to and practicing wearing of hijab in public institutions, and then it has been prohibited by the governments. The first case that comes to mind was a case of a school teacher in Geneva, in the Geneva canton in Switzerland. And she was denied even to have the case brought before the court. It was rejected. But if you lead the grounds for not accepting dealing with the case, I would say it is filled with, with your permission, male chauvinist prejudice and ignorance. The reasoning has, the event was this woman was a very good elementary school teacher. She then married a Syrian gentleman, and she converted to Islam, and she started wearing the hijab, going to school. And she did that successfully for 4 years after she had converted. There were no complaints from parents, not from colleagues, not from the children. She was a very good teacher. Then a new inspector came to the school, and she said, "What's this? There's this teacher of mine wearing the hijab. That's against Swiss regulations." And so it was brought before, the case was before courts, and she lost in all Swiss instances. And she complained to the European court, but unfortunately they rejected to treat it seriously, but with the wordings that I think are pretty one-sided. Then a more serious case, if I may say something more, is the case of Leila Shaheen, who was a medical student in Istanbul at the State University, and she was then denied access to laboratories and to exams for the reason that she was wearing the hijab at university grounds. Again, she complained about having been denied access to education. She lost before all Turkish instances. She complained to the European Court in Strasbourg, and she lost. And then she made an appeal, because I think the reasoning for rejecting her insistence that she had been denied her human right to practice her religion, for the religious observances in this case, wearing the hijab when out of home. And then she was denied. They said no to her in the tribunal, with the reasoning that wearing the hijab in this Turkish university medical faculty could be an insult, could be seen as an insult by other Muslim women who were not wearing the hijab, because she would make them feel that they were inferior Muslims by not wearing the hijab, which is a very silly, reason for, because there is no human right not to be insulted or so on. I would think that in order to protect the public against terrorist attacks, it's reasonable to take precaution steps. However, the way it is implemented can, of course, easily be seen and easily also function, well understood, as a directed against Muslims in a way which is unacceptable, because Muslims are then not treated in a way which in line with other citizens. At this point, if you permit, I would like to mention that here we are now in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where it's the only European country which has a long and respectable tradition of Islamic learning. We are now here in the office of the Dean of the Islamic faculty at the university. You, Muslims of Bosnia, have then a tradition which is crucial for all of Europe, because you have lived first under the Ottoman regime, then you have had a regime of Orthodox rulers, and then you had Catholic rulers, and then you have had a rather aggressive secularist or atheist rule. But the community and its institution have survived. So you have, I do know, a lot of experience. And what is this treasure of experience? What should we do about it? What do we need it for? Well, we Europeans outside Bosnia, we need expert knowledge from competent Muslims to tell us why these terrorist activities, which are committed, not always, but quite often by people who are subjectively convinced that this is their Islamic duty. They are doing what Islam or the Quran tells them to do. You here have the competence to say convincingly, so that everybody can understand, this is not legitimate interpretation of Islam. The Quranic passages that are used, the reference to earlier scholarly tradition in this area, should be presented and discussed, and we need your help for this, because you have experience. And in a sense, it doesn't help so much that you have a non-Muslim Western expert on religious study to tell us that this is not really Islam, or something like that. No, we need authentic Muslim expert voices, maybe at an advanced level, but also at a very primitive, simple level. This is not what Muslims should do, and if you quote the Quran out of context, then you misunderstand what is your duty as a Muslim. What you have successfully done, as far as I understand it, is simply to keep your Islamic or your Muslim identity alive, and you have cultivated it under very different circumstances. Very much of Islamic law is developed in regimes where the power is in the Muslim hands, which is not the case for your country here in Bosnia. So you have a legal tradition which has flourished and been cultivated without having this unfortunate tendency of, this is the law and it should be implemented coercively, because you don't have the means of coercion behind the law the way it was the case in earlier Muslim majority countries. So your ability to maintain Islamic legitimacy in all matters, in all spheres of life for Muslims, without having recourse to the state coercive apparatus, that is the crucial thing we need to learn from and to hear more about. Well, they are different for different groups, but I think the general answer is this, that I think it is a very bad sign, and it promises very unfortunate potential futures for Muslims if they should be more successful. After all, these are called populist groups, meaning they have a kind of wide support, but their aims is very often built on ignorance, on fear, and on messages saying that Islam or Muslims are behind our difficulties. But to spell this out is beyond what I can do in a short answer to you. but only I would say that they are dangerous, not only for Muslims, minorities, but also for democracies generally in Western European countries where Muslims are now a significant small minority, but it is growing. It is growing slowly, but it is going to go on because immigration is going to continue for various reasons, for economic reasons, because of war, like the terrible war or civil war in Syria and Iraq and so on. The reason, the motives for people to coming are, as you say, legitimate. They are legitimate if they are fleeing, if they have refugee status according to the international law for refugee status. But it is also legitimate to try to get away from desperately poor economic situations, from a situation where your children get no decent education. So there are many good motives. Western countries, like no other countries, have a duty to accept all people who want to knock at the door. You know, it isn't like that. But if you cannot be returned to your country where you come from without being threatened by danger to your life and your existence and that of your family, then you have a legitimate right to stay. And there is, as far as I understand, now a reasonable chance of in most European countries to have a more balanced, controlled process of access to their own country. At least, as I know best my own country, we had a tremendous amount of potential refugees coming in last year. This year, the numbers are down by 90%, partly because our government has made stricter regulations for access to the country. It is a question of numbers. In my country and in Sweden, even more, we have quite a large minority now of Bosnian immigrants. They are becoming Norwegians. They are not going back to Bosnia. They are becoming Swedes. They are not going back to Bosnia. But the numbers coming from Syria and Iraq are much higher. And their level of education, is much lower. And the linguistic difficulty, the language capacity is also as well developed. It is not that they are Muslims, which is the difficulty, as much as they also lack the kind of civil competence, you may say, that Bosniaks had when they came here, when they came to the Western European countries. And the economic situation in Western European countries is much more miserable now than it was in the 1990s. That was sort of at the height of expansion and so on. Then you had crises of various sorts, more problem of unemployment within the economy. So one kind of argument that people who dislike immigrants is that they say that they are taking our jobs. And if you are more sophisticated, you say, well, if they get jobs, they lower the level of income, so the income differentials become much higher in our country than it was without influx of immigrants. There is something to all of this, and it's a very complex matter to sort out. I'm not sure I am able to sort it out, at least not in this interview, but in general, I would think that, well, this is my view, and many of my colleagues' view, that life in our countries, in Western countries, is becoming more interesting, more fun, by having people with different culture, different looks, different practices coming into our countries. But there are conflicts too, in the neighborhoods, in school, and at jobs. But without country, life is also not very interesting. But there can be benign conflict and dangerous conflicts. I have very low level of prophetic prophecy, but my expectation is that it will go reasonably well. Many of us who live in these countries want that to happen, but there are intellectual battles and political battles and cultural battles in our countries. Yes, no, well, more restrictive attitude to immigration. But I think that Muslims have come to stay, and there will be more of them. If we make prognosis, we will have, maybe now we have in Europe 6% Muslims. Maybe by 2050, I heard, we will have 10%. It's still a very small fraction. And I think we can accommodate that. But it takes inventiveness and a positive approach politically, and also in our laws, how to regulate such matters, how to regulate the way we can make room for diversity without undermining our own basic institutional principles, which are human rights protection, non-discrimination, and democratic politics. But that shouldn't be impossible, but it has to be done, and it takes. We have to, what do you say in English? You have to roll up our sleeves, yeah.